Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm Christian. I am a coder for 35 years now, and at the same time I also started a couple of companies, some of them successful, some of them not. So the latest adventure is about the question, so where actually do we store the code? So why is that relevant? How do I get forward here? So can I push a button or something? Huh? Okay. So why is that important? I mean, obviously we're here on a developer conference, so I think everybody agrees that code is important. And it's, let's say you're looking like 30, 40 years into the future, and look at the companies that made it and the companies that did not make it. I think you would see a couple of patterns. I think it's probably very important to code something important or code something relevant. But I think it is also important to think about where you store your code. So essentially, you have one option in saying, okay, you share with everyone, right? So that's a popular model these days. You can put it in the cloud. There are a couple of cloud providers available, and you can try to create a community around it, like an ecosystem is the ideal situation. And there were situations like the Play stores, where these kind of ecosystems had like a tremendous success in sharing with a lot of people. And I think this is actually something that everybody needs to consider. And so this is one way to share your code. By the way, you don't have to only stare at me. If you have questions or so, just go ahead. This is a very small group anyway, and this is not a YouTube video, so you can just go ahead and ask me questions. Or if you disagree, for example. So then you have another possibility. You share it not publicly, but you share it with selected partners. So this is essentially like a private repository where you essentially whitelist those guys who can see your code, and you can decide who you work with. And this also makes a lot of sense because you can share it like worldwide. You can share it, you can turn on and off who you share with, and you still have a pretty good control over who's seeing your code and who's not. And the third possibility is that you decide to do in-house sharing essentially with your development team, or you essentially do no sharing. So essentially like lock it down as much as possible. And I know this is something not very cool these days, because everybody likes to talk about sharing with everybody, but on the other hand, you have to keep in mind that many very successful companies and also very successful people essentially got that far only because they were not sharing everything. And I think at the end of the day, if you're running a company, you have to make a decision what part of the code you want to share, completely public, maybe limited, and which one you want to really keep for yourself. And I think this is something, you know, with all the hard work of coding everything in a proper way and coding it the right way, I think you need to have a clear understanding about that, what you want to do, and then you have to execute that. So one topic that I wasn't always so aware about is who has actually the admin access. Like we had like an admin in our company, and I always thought like there is some way that nobody can read my emails. But it's not true. I mean, if I give essentially one of my employees the admin access to the email server, he can essentially read my emails. And I am not sure, but maybe sometimes if he got bored, he did that actually. And the same thing is the case with admin access to the repositories, right? And you essentially have to trust those people who have admin access. And if you do that in-house, that's one story. Usually you know who you're dealing with. But if you do that on a public server, you probably don't know who you're dealing with. And now if you think about it, you can get a little bit nervous because you have absolutely no idea who has access to your code and what are they doing with it, right? Everybody talk about hackers and breaches and Equifax and I don't know what. But at the end of the day, all it takes to get your code is to bribe that guy that has the password to your code and he makes a little backup and takes it out of the hosting company and sells it to your worst enemy, or makes it public or whatever. Okay, that's usually not the case, but it is an issue that I actually got pretty nervous about it if I really was thinking about it. And it's something to keep in mind. The other thing is you got to keep in mind is that everybody talk about AI, and we've seen that the AI robots, they essentially go already to whole Wikipedia and read everything which is in Wikipedia. And that's a great training set for learning anything about the world. So if you go and ask your Google Voice or your, I think also Amazon Alexa supports it. If you ask a question like, when are the dinosaurs, when did they extinct or something like that, and saying, according to Wikipedia, la 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 la. So I don't think we have to be too visionary to assume that the machine learning for coding will look at those public repositories at the end of the day, right? So they will go probably to the open source and read everything which is open source and try to learn how to code with that. Now the question is, what happens if those machine learning tools are going to the private repositories? I mean, there can be absolutely benefits for it. I mean, AI can maybe say, okay, look at line so-and-so. It might be looking suspicious. You might have a bug there and might be helping you improving your code quality. On the other hand, obviously your secret sauce of what you're coding might be leaking out that way into whoever is operating the learning engine. And if you look on who's hosting these sites right now, I think there's definitely some temptation to use the code which is maybe not so public. I tried to look up the terms and conditions about it, because I think there's one interesting aspect that no third party has access to the code, but it doesn't mean that the in-house robots have access to the code. So maybe it's even legal if they do that. So, yeah, so Paranoia. I don't know if you know about the Intel CEO, Andy Grove. He wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And recently, I really asking myself about getting paranoid or something like that, because I'm thinking about AI robots scanning my code suddenly and stuff like that. But I think it's maybe better to be a little bit more paranoid than a little bit more too naive. So anyway, that's maybe also a question, because that's already the end of my talk. So any questions or comments? Do you agree everything? Yeah. So.
Questions in the
Okay, so I think blockchain, let's say blockchain principle can help essentially proving that you build up intellectual property. Because, for example, when you make a repo backup that goes into a public repository, which is essentially signed by the operator of the repository, he can essentially go to court and saying, look, I have a signature from a well-known operator with a SHA so-and-so at that and that timestamp, so you can essentially go and say, this is a kind of proof that we really developed that code. And I think it's pretty safe in court to get any kind of discussions that like prior invention or later invention, so it can help in that way.
So it's more intellectual property.
That's what I see as an opportunity there to prove that. But I'm not a big blockchain expert, so. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you.